Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. I thought, and listening. I thought I would start by talking a little bit about that. I guess I find myself always feeling grateful for people to come and listen to me, and for me to have this opportunity to teach. And so I was thinking about that a little bit. How to talk about that more than just saying thank you, and it came to me to think about how, the first perfection, generosity or giving, depending on how people translate it, is broken down in various ways, but of course one of the most common ways is to talk about giving material things, giving non-fear, and teaching. And I always think of teaching as teaching the Dharma, but I looked it up today, and Tsongkhapa, it says very clearly, other sources say clearly from India, that teaching can include teaching, say, other suitable worldly things like engineering, for example. And as long as you're not teaching some people practice how to be better at non-virtuous activities, teaching can be included. Of course, it also has to have the other qualifications of a perfection, but teaching is one of the 6 perfections in general, as long as it's something suitable. And also, of course, for it to be a teaching, a giving of teaching, any kind of giving, has to be motivated by generosity. His Holiness talked about, many times now, he's spoken about his concern that people giving the teachings because as a business transaction, because they want to get something out of it. And so he says, well, if the professors, even professors teaching at the university, are practicing giving of teaching, as long as they are not only motivated by their salary. Listen to that wording very carefully. He didn't say you might not in part be motivated by your salary, but to whatever degree you're motivated by a genuine sense of generosity toward the people who are listening, then it can be considered a giving of teaching. Although not a perfection of giving, unless you have also the bodhicitta and the understanding of emptiness associated with that. So then it occurred to me that having the opportunity to teach then is a good thing for me, and to teach the Dharma in particular, and that this is a dependent arising, which arises in relationship to having an audience, so in particular a suitable audience, and that I can't just sit in my room and accumulate that merit by myself. So it is definitely contingent upon having some people to listen. By listening to me, then you benefit me. In effect, you're creating what they call a field of merit for me to generate merit in by teaching the Dharma to, in a sense. It's also said that, of course, if you can teach the Dharma in such a way as to not create merit, besides being motivated by incorrect motivations, you could also have good motivations, but teach to people who are not suitable recipients. So you should have an audience in teaching the Dharma who is interested in listening, and usually I'm basing all this on what Jai Rinpoche says about it in the Lamrim Shemo. Usually that means that they have asked to be taught. Although if you know that people are suitable to recipients, then in general they don't have to specifically ask each time. But in general, you don't. There's this sense that you don't really just want to go out and chase people around on the street, telling them about the Four Noble Truths, because, or to take another kind of example, be summoned before some aristocrat who sits on a throne and looks down at you while you explain the Four Noble Truths, because it's debasing to the Dharma, right? So anyway, it's always inspiring to come here and to see, what kind of good listeners we have here. I guess that's what feeds me, my enthusiasm for doing this. And in particular, this community it seems very suitable to teach to. And I think that I was trying to think about this a little bit today, about practice in community as distinct from, say, solitary practice. Not some topic I have a great deal of knowledge about one way or the other, but it seems to me that when we practice in community, that we learn constantly from one another, and we can inspire one another by our example. His Holiness Dalai Lama is always talking about how humans are social animals, and so we feed off each other for better or worse. And when you have an intentional community that's set up around the basic DNA, so to speak, or purpose, raison d'etre, of the community is for us to help improve our minds, then we come together to help one another improve our minds. It's much more powerful than if we just stayed in our room. I think obviously some people do benefit a lot from solitary practice, but it seems to me, this is just I'm just speaking for my own self now, that to benefit from that, you have to have some prior training together with other people, so that you're not going on the path of becoming a solitary realizer or something like that. That is, you have to be able to, when you're by yourself, nonetheless keep other people in mind and their interests and welfare in mind, which is difficult if you haven't already practiced that, together with other people, other real people, not just imaginary people. It's always very nice I love all beings, but then the particular beings who we're smelling and so forth, whose messes are under our noses, and then those are more challenging, and so it's a better kind of practice in that way. I've particularly had some experience with that this year, but anyway, yeah, I just thought before I go on to say something more about that, I just have a couple one little passage that I wanted to read related to this training together, that comes from Novice to Master by Soko Morinaga. This is my current favorite Zen book, and I've actually said that having wandered in teaching Buddhism at the university through many, many, many different Zen books, I've sort of decided that this will be the Zen book for the rest of my career in introducing Buddhism. And Soko Morinaga Roshi says that each person who finds his way into the training hall to practice is born different from others. Each one comes into the world with different abilities and has different experiences and education and thinks different thoughts. No two are alike. And if every one of the multifarious individuals who enter the training hall were to constantly assert their own way and to insist, this is what I think, this is how we should do it, then there would be no practice that would go on. It would just be sort of like Congress, maybe. Like Christine say. Yeah, maybe. So, as we'll be getting around to talking about, this year was kind of difficult for me in that my wife, we were married for 28 years, died in November, and this brought me into the experience of actually living by myself, which, as I've emailed with Venerable Chodron about, at first I found very difficult, and then after a while I found seductively pleasant, in the sense that I didn't have to think about anybody else, and I could just say, well, I think I'll leave the dishes in the sink for 3 days, and no one cares, because it's just me and the dogs. And I'm not actually harming anyone, apparently at least, by just doing things. I know that my mother lives by herself, and whenever I go to visit her, she has things arranged in a very idiosyncratic way, because there's nobody else. So she likes to keep her trash in the sink, for example. And it doesn't, she doesn't have to bend over to pick it up or anything. It's close to where her natural level is. And it doesn't harm or affect anyone else, because there's no one else there, ever, right? So I think just, as not someone who's qualified to do some sort of solitary practice, it's been my experience that living alone has tended to increase my self-centered tendencies to just, because I don't have to, in an ongoing way, think about another person like every hour and how, I should not be thinking about them in relationship to what I'm doing, which was how living in a family was for me. I mean, people have to work together. In my particular family, we raised 2 kids together who are young adults, and they're very much oriented towards going out into the world and helping others. And I think that that is, a reflection of kind of the values of my family community, my family equivalent of a sangha, that we practice together, helping each other focus on how to learn to be more helpful to others. My wife was not a, well, let's just say, since we've had the word from Venerable Tamcher's parents this weekend, is that my wife is a free thinker. And she didn't really have much interest in religion. And so we raised our kids within kind of what Venerable Chodron was talking yesterday about, in the context of teaching them values of kindness and honesty, which I don't think, which I took very seriously. I wouldn't see it as because, like, okay, so I'm looking at it from a Buddhist point of view, and I see like kindness as a reflection of our capacity for bodhicitta, and that it brings that out in people to practice in that way, and is a sprout of a universal compassion to teach children to practice kindness and to think about others as the basic thing. And then honesty seems less obvious, but as I've thought about it, seems to be very clear that teach kindness and honesty, which is exactly what Venerable Chodron said yesterday. Honesty is related at a secular, more rudimentary apparently level, but it's related to wisdom. It's very difficult. I mean, honesty is basically the opposite of self-deception and opposite of deceiving others. If we're going to be honest, of course, we have to not just, most people aren't honest. There's all kinds of research on this. People lie all the time. It's very difficult to not lie. This is a very hard precept to keep. And so if you practice honesty and then see that as something that involves not deceiving yourself, it leads down the path of saying, well, like, who am I really? I'm telling myself that I'm this sort of being, but what am I really like? I don't think this is any kind of stretch. I mean, basically, honesty is, you could say in a sense that wisdom is the ultimate form of honesty, looking nakedly at things the way they are and not trying to see them or present them to yourself or others in a way that's different from how they are, even if that cuts against the grain of how you would like to see them and be more comfortable about. So I guess our family teaching, which was kind of like able to be seen from one point of view as a free thinker and from another point of view as Buddhist, was to keep others in your heart, and that includes the others within the family, but then others who need our help beyond. And so it was a big change and difficulty for me. That Valerie, my wife, died in November, and I talked to some people about this. Was kind of even though it was we may think that because we meditated on death and explained this to people that we've sort of factored in this, and certainly it wasn't a surprise that she died, but it was a shock nonetheless. It's a little bit hard to describe that. I tried to talk to people about how something can be a shock without being a surprise, but this is my experience. Suppose that someone's going to hit you on the head, and then they hit you in the head very hard. It's something like that, Well, it's not surprising, but nonetheless, your body and your mind are in a state of shock. And this is how I would experience, this is how I would maybe try to describe what this experience has been like for me. And so it affects my whole body, which includes the physical basis for my ability to think and concentrate and sleep and so forth. And so I spent a lot of time drifting around my house aimlessly from room to room, like not remembering why I had gone in each room by the time I got there. And I involuntarily became a field of casserole merit. I hadn't volunteered for that, as like you have volunteered, to be the monastics volunteer to become a field of merit for the laity in Buddhist practice. But you can also be drafted into being a field of merit by in the world becoming a widow, essentially, and then it becomes interesting, like because. Maybe you don't want another casserole. How to not be cranky towards people, when you're just like, God, it's not enough that I have to lose my wife. I now have to be nice to all these people who are trying to be nice to me, but aren't really helping. You know what I'm saying? So that was a little complicated, right? And it took me a while to get around to understand, having, strange to say, but, having compassion and extending love to people who were already trying to help me but were actually irritating me. So during this time, when my brain was completely fried, I oddly had one thing which engaged me intellectually pretty much, and that would be through the whole last several months. And that was some curiosity about this idea of not knowing. And even when I was even within a month after Valerie had died, when I wasn't really sleeping, I had started to scrawl all things on a manila folder, associations about this in the middle of the night. And so when invited to speak here, I assigned myself this topic, and I have only myself to blame for the difficulties in sorting it out. Because as with a lot of the things I've spoken about here, it's not as though I already understand this fully. I'm sort of in the process of thinking about it. I'm sort of inviting us to think it through together. And by thinking it through, what is it that we're thinking through together? It's this question of, can not knowing be a Buddhist path or a Buddhist practice or a Buddhist ideal? And if it can, in what way? I'll come back to that question in a minute. But first, let me give you just like an outline. Having introduced this a little bit, I'll talk about what my Garchak, my table of contents for this series of talks is. First, I decided it's important to start by saying something about the Rangluk, that is our own view, because it could be very confusing if I just start talking about what these various Zen or Mahamudra people say about not knowing related things if we haven't sort of started with explaining, where I'm coming from in terms of thinking about this. That is the views of Tsongkhapa and the Dalai Lama, I guess I would take as the two main reference points, who have the same basic viewpoint but different ways of talking about that viewpoint in some interesting ways. And so first I'm going to talk about the own view, and then I'll get to the question of how this question arises. Like how does it come up? Why does it come to be interesting to even talk about not knowing? And then third, I'll talk about the Chan Zen roots of this idea of not knowing. Fourth, I'll very briefly compare this kind of negative approach to spirituality to some parallel things in other spiritual traditions. That will be kind of brief. And then I'll go into Indo-Tibetan traditions related to not knowing, even if they don't use exactly that phrase. And then at the end, that's number 6, I'll try to figure out what we can take away from this, or what I've figured out from it so far, and I'm sure that at that point you can probably contribute because I know that people have lots of knowledge related to this knowledge that I don't. So first, something about our own point of view. If you look in your, let's see, if you look in your handout that was just given out, maybe let's start with 34, number 34, which is on page 11. So this is from Tsongkhapa's. Tsongkhapa is the founder of the Gelugpa order. He lived from 1357 to 1419, and his first major treatise in which he laid out his view is called the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path. And in the volume 3 of that, on page 129, and I made some like little ellipses. He says, disciples who progress by way of the Supreme Mahayana will attain, upon reaching the goal, the sublime embodiment of truth, or the truth body, and the sublime embodiment of form. This is based, so that's the fruit, or the result. This is based on their having amassed along the path immeasurable collections of merit and sublime wisdom, collections within which method and wisdom are inseparable. Very nice point, right? That you can't each of the collections is arises from an interdependency between method and wisdom practices. You can just pick which one you'd like to do. This in turn definitely depends upon attaining certain knowledge of the diversity of phenomena. That means all the different kinds of conventional things that appear in the world and exist. And this profound knowledge understands that the relationship of cause and effect, conventionally existent cause and effect, is such that specific beneficial and harmful effects arise from specific causes, right? As the Venerable Chögyam was explaining yesterday when we were looking at Aryadeva. At the same time, amassing the collections of merit and wisdom also definitely depends on attaining another certain knowledge. You have to have two certain knowledges. Another certain knowledge of the real nature of phenomena, actually the ultimate nature or emptiness. This means reaching a profound certainty that all phenomena lack even a particle of essential or intrinsic nature. And this is the key to the path. Whether you get it right depends on your philosophical view of the basic situation. So, I picked this out because here we have Tsongkhapa in one passage says, okay, the basis, path, and result, or fruit, right? The basis is that you have these two truths. You have conventional existing things and ultimate emptiness of all these things. That both of these exist, and on the path you have to attain definite, what does he say? Certain knowledge of each of these two realities. You could say kinds of things that exist. In that sense, realities, and the path requires, having both of these kinds of knowing, right? And that the culmination of these two types of knowing, when they interact and synergize fully over a long period of time, it culminates in the becoming a person who perfectly embodies both with universal compassion and profound wisdom. And that profound wisdom, well, he doesn't explain that right here, does not erase knowledge of tables and chairs or living beings and their suffering. It includes a knowledge of both all the conventional phenomena and the ultimate phenomena. So I wanted to put that out there because that's sort of where I'm coming from, the general approach that we take in thinking about the importance of knowing, both as in relationship to how things exist as a practice, and then the culmination of the practice is a mind in which you're the best of all possible knowers and not an unknower. So then let's look at 30 and 31 on page 10. So Tsongkhapa quotes 3 times, and I believe that he does not quote any other verse 3 times, but in a single in Lamrim Chemo, which is a very long text, he manages to quote 3 different times this one verse from the Samadhi Raja Sutra, King of Concentration Sutra, and one of those places I cite here. If you analytically discern the lack of self and phenomena, and if you cultivate that analysis in meditation, this will cause the result. attainment of nirvana, and there is no peace by any other means. Now, why does Tsongkhapa quote this 3 different times? Because he wants to show that Sutra says that analysis is necessary in order to discern or know specifically some specific object, that is, a specific lack. And why is that so important? Because the root of suffering is the false ascription of a kind of self to things that they don't actually have. So what's liberating is this knowledge of this certain lack, and you can only get that, according to this sutra, right, by first analyzing and realizing this through logical, reasoned analysis. And then, of course, you go on to take what you've understood and cultivate that analysis in meditation. This is a very interesting line, because he's saying, oh, meditation isn't where you just stop analyzing and just set your mind without thinking on that thing that you've thought about, or anything else, or nothing. No, it's like you're actually analyzing in meditation, according to the sutra, right? And so that's what leads to, a state which is ultimately liberating. It doesn't mean that you'll just think your way all the way to Buddhahood and then you'll be the best thinker. It doesn't mean that, but it's making it extremely clear that given where we're starting with, we need to use analysis in order to understand the basic nature of things and start down the path. And so then 31, Tsongkhapa is talking about this a little bit more. Understanding that you will not overcome cyclical existence unless you overcome its cause, you research its roots, considering what might be the root of cyclical existence, and you thereby become certain from the depths of your heart that ignorance acts as the root, seeing that overcoming this ignorance depends on the wisdom that knows that the self, as conceived by ignorance, does not exist. Then you will then see that you have to refute that self analytically. So be certain in that refutation, that logic that proves that this thought that you're attached to of a self-instituting self is wrong. Be certain in that refutation, relying on scriptures and lines of reasoning that contradict its existence and prove its non-existence. Right? This is indispensable. After you've arrived at the philosophical view that discerns that the self and that which belongs to it lack even a shred of intrinsic nature, then accustom yourself to that. And of course, by saying accustom, he's implying that you're meditatively cultivating that understanding over a long period of time. It's not like just you accustom yourself to it for a week and then you're a Buddha. But anyway, but that's what he means. So I think that is my, what do you say, inoculation against confusion. I hope, because what I'm going to be talking about now for a while is like coming from like exploring some people who talk in a very different way, and part of why it's interesting to me is, I think I understand intellectually what Tsongkhapa is saying, and then when I hear people as Buddhists saying things that sound so different from that, then it provokes some curiosity in me and try to understand what's going on there. Yeah. So, let me see where. So that relates to this idea of how it could be valuable. I'm just saying how I get to be curious, but how could it be valuable for us to think about things from other perspectives, not just considering our own system. So it's clear that the Dalai Lama and Tsongkhapa both studied lots of different views other than the one that they hold as their private position. So there's a model there of there being apparently a great value in considering what we can learn by listening to others who see things or frame things or at least talk about things very differently. So at minimum, we could learn what things we really have in common with them. So people might think, only Buddhists have ethics until they they study some other tradition, for example, or only Buddhists know how to attain deep states of concentration, and then discover that, of course, that's not true, right? But then there's other things too that we might learn that we have in common, and Also, we might learn would it be skillful to talk to people who are coming from a really different point of view. Just to get an example that pops to my mind out of From Here to Enlightenment by His Holiness, he talks about how it's very useful, to teach about mindful to his Christians, people who are very dedicated and are cultivating a good heart through the practice of Christianity, that he teaches them about the various kinds of Buddhist teachings that they might find useful to incorporate within their Christian practice, but he doesn't teach them about emptiness. And in fact, if they're curious about emptiness, he says, well, you should be aware, caveat, that studying emptiness may undermine your faith in God. And so, and this is an example of being skillful. He's not thinking, well, you have this stupid idea about God, and I'll refute it for you, and therefore you'll be a better person. He doesn't think like that, right? Buddhists are taking the long view here, right? And it's like, well, in the short term, what will create more peace in the world, right, is getting people through whatever path, if it's free thinking or Christianity or Buddhism, to develop the good heart, and not just fighting over differences about our view, right? And in the long term, from a Buddhist point of view, people will come around gradually, right? And because they all have Buddha nature, and so we want to plant the right seeds, and maybe pushing things on people when it's not the right time isn't helpful in that way. So also, it's possible we don't want to that we could learn something when you hear suppose that there are people who are actually meaning the same thing that we are in some sense, but they talk about it in a radically different way. Like they've taken all the categories that we put together and they've chopped them up all completely different. But in the end, the meaning, or that could be the same. I'm not saying that it is, but it could be the same, right? And so it could be that you can become more flexible about the way you use words, or the way you consider is acceptable for other people to use words, understanding that these words are not the truth. They're just different ways of pointing at the truth, and we have a particular, connection with a certain way of framing and pointing out. But other people could be getting to, very deep or useful understandings also with a different kind of way of framing things. It's a possibility, certainly in some cases, that, and you don't want to say that this is definitely the case, but it's possible that in some cases these different ways of looking at things, different way of talking at things, are all convergent. And His Holiness in From Here to Enlightenment on page 145, he basically implies that this may be the case about the four traditions in Tibetan Buddhism and other places. He says it more directly. So when it comes to the final understanding that that Gelug and Nyingma and Gagyu and Sakyapa are pointing at, when it comes to their final understanding, the Panchen Lama has said that all of the diverse Dharma teachings converge for someone who is learned in definitive teachings, skilled in reasoning, and possessed of profound yogic realization. The last being an important point. If you just rely on reasoning, it always seems that things are contradicting each other. But he's saying, well, if you really have an experiential understanding of what these words are pointing at, then you might find that they're much more convergent than they appear. They may appear contradictory in the way they're expressed, but end up in practice not being so much so. Anyway, I'm not saying that you can assume that everybody's converging, or that there's just one big mountain and everybody's coming at it from different points of view. I'm not saying that. But I don't think we can preclude that because someone's using the wrong words, they might not be having something that's very useful and helpful to say. Just not in the kind of words that are part of our tradition of talking about things. And then also there's this idea that, even if suppose it's wrong, it doesn't mean, ultimately, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not extremely helpful for some people. right? Because if you think about the 4 tenet systems, for example, that the Buddha taught, like almost all of them end up being wrong, right? But nonetheless, he's teaching them skillfully to help people who have different dispositions and levels of understanding. And on page 39 and 40 of From Here to Enlightenment, His Holiness says, and this is astonishing if you consider that he absolutely does not believe in a divine creator, and he thinks it is completely illogical to believe in a divine creator, which, as Venerable Jerome was talking about yesterday on teaching Aryadeva, is like this is a common ancient Buddhist position. Basically, believe in an all-powerful divine creator is illogical and can be disproven logically. But nonetheless, His Holiness says, in Christianity, there really is a beginning. God created everything. So this life is created by God. I think this is wonderful. It's a great teaching because the purpose, the heart of Christianity is love and affection. So knowing that this very life was created by God brings a powerful feeling of intimacy with God and a sense that God is like your own mother. We know that our bodies come from our mothers. They come from our parents, but particularly our mothers. And even animals feel so close to their mothers. So in that same very intimate sense, when you feel that this very life, this very body, everything about yourself is just a gift from God, then you are for that reason very, very close to God. And because of this sense of intimacy, you become more willing to listen to God's advice, and you really want to know what God wants of you. That's the Dalai Lama. I'm thinking, God, that's one of the best Christian teachings I've heard in a long time. And it's like, of course, he goes on in the rest of the chapter to explain why it's completely illogical to believe in a divine creator. But that doesn't stop him from having like a really profound, understanding of how this could be extremely beneficial to a lot of people. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that I think is important to keep in mind. Maybe I should say, and we'll get to that, when Tsongkhapa talks about in Lamrim Chemo about not knowing sorts of views, he's not as charitable, and the phrase vile misconception may come up, but maybe we'll come back to that later. So anyway, I think that we've made that point number one, our own view. That's enough about that. So given that that's my starting point philosophically, the kind of way of talking about Buddhism that's my home base or makes most sense to me, then how would the question of not knowing as a Buddhist path or a Buddhist view of reality maybe, or a Buddhist ideals that one is seeking to attain, how would that even come up? And it's a question that I had never asked until recently, because it seems so obvious superficially that the answer is no, it cannot be a path, an ideal, or a practice. Of course not, because Buddha, the idea of Buddha is all-knowing, not all-unknowing. Finally attained to all-unknowingness, it doesn't come up. And, right? Unfortunately, we knew many things before, but we've undone all that and attained perfect unknowing. What would that be? Non-niscience or something? Omniscience. That would be omniscience, right? Unknowing everything, or misknowing everything anyway. So that doesn't come up. I never heard of that. And then also, if you look at it from the other side, there's like, well, what causes us to be suffering? Everybody says marikpa in Tibetan or avidya in Sanskrit, and it literally just means, not knowing. I mean, avidya, means not, and vid, means know in a sort of cognitive video, to know by seeing, and vya is a nominalizer. So yeah, that's like not knowing is in some sense. And of course, we know that the word avidya doesn't really mean not knowing. It means a mistaken kind of false knowledge, you could say. But nonetheless, it seems very clear that it's like, because we don't know something that we suffer needlessly. It's not because we have some knowledge that we have to undo, right? So that explains why I didn't worry about this until recently. And then why did I come to worry about it? Well, because while Valerie was dying, and I mean the last 2 weeks, she was in home hospice care. And I don't actually remember who told me to read Being with Dying by Joan Halifax, but I don't know. Somebody told me to read it, and I read it while she was dying, actually, you know. And hospice workers were coming and going from the house. And my friend Nancy, I think has come here, who's the Buddhist doctor from Maui. And Nancy told me that I should be careful because it might be too intense for me, but I was like, huh. I don't really know how anything a book could be saying would be more intense than, like, you know, lying here on the bed while my wife is dying next to me. So that seems like what I liked about reading things like this is that they seem to be more realistically reflective of what I was experiencing and not, you know, withdrawing from it or talking about something else. So yeah, that's why that book really appealed to me, because it's based in a deep, long-standing intimacy with dying, and so I found some benefit in it, I would say. And yeah, at the first stage, it was the first book that I was able to read, and for a while I really couldn't read any other books. Then I moved on to other things, but yeah, it was a starting point for me being able to think, was just to be able to read a paragraph or two at a time in Being with Dying by Joan Halifax, and I brought that book along. So Being with Dying is like is a book, says Cultivating Compassion and Fearlessness in the Presence of Death by Joan Halifax, who's a Roshi, Roshi Joan, people call her, and she has a center in Santa Fe called Upaya Zen Center. And it's basically, this book seems to put in print what she does in workshops that she runs for various kinds of healthcare professionals to prepare them for working with dying people, and it seems like a very great service that she, and helping a great deal of people. And I'll just quickly say something about her background. I mean, she was an anthropologist who studied the Dogon people in Africa and the Huichol in Mexico. And then she became a medical anthropologist and focused on doing research on the culture in healthcare settings and hospitals. You know, the anthropologists study human culture, but you don't have to just study it in tribal villages. You can study it in, you know, Western hospitals. And so she did that. And so she understands a lot about, you know, how those institutions function for human beings. And then she married this guy Stanislaus Grof, who was doing research on LSD, and including, though, LSD with dying people. And then she also, starting when she was in Mexico working with the Huichol, started doing Buddhist practice. And she studied with Sung San, who's this, you know, Korean Zen teacher, and also with Thich Nhat Hanh. And apparently she was named a Dharma teacher or something equivalent to that, a Dharma instructor, Dharmacharya, by both of those teachers. And then she studied with Bernie Glassman, Roshi, Bernie, and who gave her transmission, so that she officially is, you know, in the lineage of Zen teachers through Bernie and not through Sung San or Thich Nhat Hanh. And Roshi Bernie is in the lineage of Maizumi Roshi, who apparently gave transmission to 15 or 16 people, including Joko Beck. So that means, I guess, Joko was Joan's Dharma aunt or something, you know, something like that, because of the Bernie and the connection back to Maizumi Roshi. That's how I understand her, you know, background. But she describes her motivation in working with the dying without making much reference to her former husband, but rather to her childhood, when she saw her grandmother, like, taking care of everybody who was sick and everybody who was dying in the family. And then when her grandmother got sick, nobody knew what to do with her, and they pretty much left her alone and unsupported as she was dying. And that because of this idea about dying just being hidden away and people not wanting to think about death or face it, right? And that she felt that her grandmother died in needless misery because of fear of facing the reality of death. It was part of the culture generally, of course, but affecting her family in particular. So coming out of that, of course, then she gets this motivation, you could say, compassionate motivation to have a career in which she changes that kind of culture, which she's observed as an anthropologist and also has a historic trauma as a result of in her childhood, or young adulthood actually, with the grandmother. And so then she does this ongoing training work. Nancy, for example, the doctor who came from Hawaii, is actually, been through this training. And many people who work in hospices, not most necessarily, but a lot of people who work in hospice settings have experienced either her training or something that's related to it, downstream from it in some way. And her training is based on Buddhism. It's based on Zen Buddhism as she understands it, that she's giving these people who, by and large, are not Buddhists, except Nancy. But, most of the hospice people, of course, are not Buddhists. But she teaches them things that are based on Buddhism, that come out of Buddhism, so that they can help the dying people and the families of the dying people that she's working with. She says in her book, Being with Dying, that at first she was a little self-conscious about that. Maybe going back to, I was talking about, like, you don't want to, preach the Dharma to somebody who's not asking you to preach the Dharma, so to speak, right? And that maybe they would be put off by being told Buddhist things if they're not Buddhists. But of course, she found that this was very beneficial to people, that people told her how much that was helping them, and they were able to help a lot of other people in turn. So she overcame her self-consciousness about that, using Buddhist teachings to help in these non-Buddhist settings. And so then she puts together this book as sort of reflecting what she's doing in these workshops. I find this book to be, and then given the positive things I've said about it, I should be clear that I find it very confusing. Partly because it's founded on this idea of not knowing, which I don't know what that is. And also because you don't know what the structure of it is. Like what she says so many fascinating and useful things, but I don't know why they're being said in any particular order. It's all, and I don't understand the structure of the chapters or the structure of the paragraphs often within the chapters. Even though I reread it, I still haven't really figured it out. But nominally, it has a structure, which is that it's organized around 3 tenets, and there's chunks of the book. The not knowing track is not, the 3 tenets are not knowing, bearing witness, and compassionate action. And so there's 3 chunks of the book. One, the not knowing part, but of course not knowing comes up in all the other parts too, and then the bearing witness part, and then the compassionate action part. So it's a very rough structure. And the list is completely strange to me. I'm like, what could this possibly be? I'm trying to understand this book, and I don't even understand the outline for the book, right? Or the first point about not knowing. So maybe a good example of not knowing might be, I don't know what the heck this list of 3 things means, but I want to know, and I want to not know, I don't want to not know, I want to know. So that means maybe I'm already doing it wrong. I should stop wanting to not know and just be okay with not knowing what the heck that list of 3 things means. I don't know. I'm partly making a joke, but it's like... yes, right. But I think, yeah. Well, when I proposed this topic to Venerable Chodron, she said something that really stuck with me and seems to be right, which is that there are lots of kinds of not knowing, and all the good ones involve knowing of some sort or another. Which I think is, we can just put that before us in our minds, as I do when I was trying to sort this out. So the first clue to me about what she might mean by not knowing, I know that she's an anthropologist. I know that anthropologists study rituals. I know that rituals and human rituals include rites of passage. And so it becomes very clear that for her, she's thinking about not knowing, bearing witness, and compassionate action as being related through the 3 phases of a ritual called a rite of passage, which occurs in cultures around the world, which is a kind of ritual that marks a social transition. So from becoming a lay woman to becoming a bhikshuni, or from becoming a civilian to becoming a soldier, or from being single to being married, or from being a child to being an adult. That's like one of the biggest examples that people usually talk about. So any kind of ritual that effects, that brings about this spiritual or social transition in status is called a rite of passage. And a rite of passage has been classically understood by anthropologists as having 3 phases. First, separation, where you're cut off from everything that you thought you knew or thought you were. Like imagine all the different people with their different hairdos and their different points of view going into basic training and having their heads shaved, right? And having all their civilian clothes, which they had different kinds of t-shirts and so forth. They're all stripped off, right? So they're stripped. They're separated from their families. They're stripped of any idiosyncratic distinguishing marks. They're stripped of their special haircut that they got, from the barber that wasn't the barber that the other person went to, and so forth. They're stripped of all of that, and then they go into a condition of liminality, where they're just melted down. They have to be hidden away from the rest of us, because they're no longer civilians, but they're not yet soldiers. They're betwixt and between. They're in between in between worlds, in between categories that we have names for. So they have to be in a dark place, in a hidden place, metaphorically, in a place where people don't see them all the time. And then in that place, they're shown something, they learn something, something is, something is gained or affected upon them, which imprints them, like the, stamp on wax, with the pattern for the new identity they're going to assume as a nun or a soldier or an adult. And then once that's full, once that imprint takes, so to speak, and they're shaped up into the form that they're supposed to have, which could involve, say, removing the foreskin, in some cultures, right? If you're going to become a man instead of a boy. Something has been changed about you, and you've been shown the secrets that only the adults know, right? Then you can come out and show your face, because you now have an adult face and adult status. And you can go forth into the world, that's called reincorporation, joining the body of the world with the new powers and the new identity that you've gained in the liminal period. So superficially, I didn't notice that there was the parallel between separation, liminality, and reincorporation, 3 phases of a rite of passage. But it's very, very clear that Roshi Joan understands the things that her 3 tenets that she got from her teacher, Bernie Glassman. Not knowing, bearing witness, and compassion and action, that she maps these directly on to the 3 phases of a rite of passage. Separation, liminality, and reincorporation. So separation is like, dropping everything that you think you are or think you know, right? So as you enter into a place of darkness or invisibility to the rest of the world, where you can become something new. Like a caterpillar goes into a cocoon. It doesn't just sit out here in the open and go from being a caterpillar into a butterfly. It has to first go into an invisible condition, right, to make that transition. So that's how she understands this. You could think of, compassion and action as the last phase. It's like, entering the world, going back into the world with helping hands. You become a new person, and you go out to play that role to be helpful to people. So the Buddhist path, obviously, it has a structure that can be mapped onto this. A lot of people have talked, like Joseph Campbell, for example, has talked about a quest myth. It's like the universal myth. Probably everybody knows about this, but it goes back to the 1950s. But it's exactly the same structure, that there's a hero of the story, somehow different, is dissatisfied in some way with the world that he classically finds himself in, that he has to leave behind the ordinary world and go into a different world, right, where he overcomes obstacles, makes allies, and then gains something new, some power that's beyond this world. And then he doesn't just sit out there in that other world and think, oh, it's great, I finally got this gold at the end of the rainbow. No, he goes back into the world and brings whatever wisdom or treasure or understanding that he got in the other world back to benefit the people that he left behind, right? And so if you think about, it's like a rite of passage, quest myth, the same three-part structure, and it relates to the path in Buddhism. That actually Joseph Campbell took the Buddha's life story, the classical story, as being one of his main examples. Of course, he thought that this pattern was everywhere in the world, in every culture, and all the time, and everybody's subconscious. But he took the story of Buddha's life as one of his main examples of this that fit best with the kind of thing that he was looking for. The extraordinary birth story of the Buddha, and the sense of being dissatisfied, leaving home, making friends, spiritual friends, overcoming obstacles such as fasting too much and so forth, and then Mara, right, underneath the tree, and then ultimately getting something that's brings perfect peace and liberation, and then not just sitting there under the tree and taking a deep breath and digging on it, but getting up and then reincorporating compassionate action, going back into the world with helping hands. So anyway, this is my first thing I wanted to say. It's very clear that this is part of what she's doing. That not knowing means dropping all of our presuppositions that we bring to the table in a spiritual practice or the practice of taking care of somebody who's dying. Beginning to unknow what we think we know so that we can be more open to what is unfolding before us. So when Roshi Joan talks about this in relationship to her own life, she doesn't quite spell this out, but it becomes very clear that the implicit quest narrative of her life, the not knowing and the bearing witness and the compassionate action, is one, knowing that she didn't know how to help her grandmother, right, and being disturbed by that, and two, going on a long journey of learning and bearing witness as to what needed to be seen in order to help, and then finally becoming a teacher of hospice workers and so forth, be helpful. But okay, so that much is very clear. I think I understand that. And I was like, yes, but it's very clear that this is maybe not even mainly what she means. It's certainly not only what she means. It's part of what she means. So part of what she means is realizing that we're as yet too ignorant to really help others effectively. But if that's all she meant, it wouldn't be such a big challenge for those of us who come from a pro-knowing point of view. So maybe I'll just read you a couple of what passages where she says things about not knowing that make it clear that she has something very different in mind. Our practice of not knowing points to an openness in perspective, an openness that's deeper than a story, deeper than our expectations, deeper than our wishes, deeper than our personality, deeper than our cultural constructs. And beyond that, in practicing not knowing, you bring yourself to a place where you already are, your original dwelling place. And this bigger view is already available to you now in the unfiltered experience of this very moment. An experience below the rippling concepts and deeper than any language. Just sit down and breathe. Take a moment to stabilize your mind and allow your natural wisdom to rise. I promise you that you will see for yourself that nothing, including your own individual identity, exists in the absolute sense of an unchanging, permanent truth. And then she says, with our reality wide and clear, we discover that inexpressibly vast horizon of not knowing. So I started to, reading many passages like this, I started to think that although part of not knowing is knowing what we don't know, and instead of just thinking we know, that it also is, related to some basic meditative practice that she sees as connecting us to our fundamental nature, and that in some sense, it's that perfect not knowing is somehow the culmination of this. Do you see what I'm saying? That she has not knowing as terms of the basic condition of reality a practice that puts us in touch with that, and therefore is, this ocean of not knowing is the culmination of our lives. She talks about that also in terms of people dying, and going, I don't know. If I say going into not knowing, I might be slightly distorting what she says, but it definitely feels like that. That's what he's saying. So, he doesn't actually mention Shunryu Suzuki Roshi's, famous book, but she directly links this idea of not knowing to the idea of beginner's mind, which probably we all know. The famous line that in beginner's mind there are many possibilities, in expert's mind there are few, and that gaining knowledge or expertise closes down possibilities of creativity, openness, and responsiveness. And she also uses the word fresh, having a fresh mind. Now for her, a fresh mind means one that, quote, does not rely on facts, knowledge, or concepts. So, yeah, then, I'm just like, okay, what does it rely on? And also is not attached to any fixed ideas about the self or others. Because we don't have any fixed notions in not knowing, it can just rest with things as they are. Okay, so this idea that not knowing allows us to, coincides with the basic nature of reality. Is very, very different from where Tsongkhapa is coming from. And in fact, I think I can show you that it's one of the views that he most vehemently refutes. Yeah. She says that not knowing reflects the potential that all beings have for perfect awakening. So she says there is such thing as perfect awakening. She doesn't say perfect sleeping. But this perfect awakening is, she understands as inconceivable, all-pervasive, intimate, and whether actually or metaphorically, dying means no longer clinging to the small island of our current identity, but setting out into a vast, unknown, unknowable ocean of who we fundamentally are. Okay, that's a slight paraphrase, but basically that's what she says. So, there's plus, okay, once you have that in place, you can see that, so her main metaphor, mostly how we know things is by seeing, and then number two is by listening. According to neuroscientists, I'm not making this up, that's what he's looking in the brain, so that's how the big connections. And so, metaphorically, poetically, for Roshi Joan, when she's talking about not knowing, she's always talking about darkness. And in fact, her earlier book, A Journey Through Buddhist Practice and Tribal Wisdom, making connection between her anthropologist, shamanistic expert self and her Roshi self, is called The Fruitful Darkness. Right, so she's all about darkness in a sense, because darkness represents this sort of, and I'm not, this is her, not me, like a womb of open possibilities. It represents this beginner's mind in which there's all potential is there. Nothing's been locked in or frozen into place, and. She talks a lot about some obvious things that, darkness in the sense of pain or suffering or failure or loss or grief, being stripped or just having everything that you think you are and know be destroyed is something that's lucky or fruitful, because it gives us opportunity to become the new being that we have the potential to become. And she tells, in somewhat indirect ways, a story about her own depression during her 20s and how she meditated her way through it, basically. Did some hiking too, apparently. But the key point is that she knew intuitively that thinking about it would not help. That she had to get through it in some other way that it didn't involve analysis. I guess I'll just put it like that. That's the point. So obviously this darkness corresponds to this, going into darkness, I guess, is not knowing, and then actually being in darkness is this liminal phase in between one thing and another, where you're outside of the categories that the world has names for, So we have to make up a name for the people in between. So Also, I think that because she's an anthropologist who's an expert on shamanism, I think that she doesn't explicitly say this, but it's pretty clear that she understands this depression from her 20s as kind of like a shamanic illness. So, shamans, maybe is classically before a person could become an intermediary between the spirit world and our world, they often undergo a period of profound illness. Whatever, it's like hard to say what that is. But anyway, that's the case. And that then if they're able to recover from this, it's because they've formed allies in the spirit world, and they maintain these alliances after they recover. And then they can come out of that dark place and use these friends that they've made in the other world to help other people. Or maybe not. They at least have some power. Could be using it to help other people, right? So that's part of another little level of what's going on there, I think. And then I thought maybe we would look at what her teacher says about not knowing. I don't know that it adds too much to what we already learned, but it adds a little bit of a different twist on this. And this is passage number 3, which is on the first page. I don't know where my passage number on my first page is. Well, I have it on. You guys have it. Oh, here it is. Bernie Glass. I got this off of Bernie Glassman's website, so I didn't have to type this one. That was a cut and paste. So Roshi Bernie is, I don't know how to say very much about him, but he's doing a lot of good work with his Zen knowledge. He's done some things of having people practice homeless Zen, and then his main thing has been taking people to Auschwitz and having them do Zazen on the railroad tracks where people were being brought into Auschwitz, and then they do have discussion groups about their experience and so forth. So anyway, this is where that list of 3 things comes from, is from Bernie's Glassman. Not knowing is the first tenet. It means entering a situation without being attached to any opinion, idea, or concept, so that one's totally open to the situation, and that means deeply listening. It's the role of the Bodhisattva to bear witness. I'm sorry, that should be the next paragraph. So that's all he says about not knowing. That's it. Then he goes on about bearing witness, number 2. It's the role of the Bodhisattva to bear witness. The Buddha can just stay in the realm of not knowing, being as not knowing as he wants to be, or she. It's a realm of blissful non-attachment, whereas the Bodhisattva vows to save the world, and therefore to live in the world of attachment. For that, a world of attachment is also the world of empathy, passion, and compassion. Ultimately, she accepts all the difficult feelings and experiences that arise as part of everyday life, such as watching people die, as nothing but ways of revelation. Each moment pointing, each of these difficult experiences pointing to the present moment as a moment of awakening. Bearing witness gives birth to a deep and powerful intelligence that does not depend on study or action, but on presence. So I think that maybe that relates to this idea that there's some kind of useful knowing that's coming out of not knowing. We bear witness to the joy and suffering that we encounter. Rather than observing the situation, we become the situation. We're so intimately bearing witness to the situation, right, that we're not separating ourselves from it, whether it's disease or war or poverty or death or genocide. You bear witness when you're simply there. You don't turn away. You don't turn your head. You open your heart to even very painful things that you don't know what to do about that are right in front of you. Right? That's what he's saying. And then loving actions are those actions that arise naturally when one enters into a situation in the state of not knowing and then bears witness to that situation. It has nothing to do with one's opinions or others' opinions as to whether it is a loving action or not. I thought that was an interesting point. So, he implies that some people, it has to do with your own motivation and whether it arises out of this not knowing. If you're in touch with your own not knowing and this sort of intimate presence with things that he's describing as coming out of that, then you can act in a loving way even though other people might see what you're doing as strange or harsh, but it isn't, ultimately, because it's coming out of this space of love. Well, that's what he says. So that's a lot to this. This is a lot to digest, I think. Not knowing means not attachment to any idea, opinion, or concept. It's blissful. But when we have not knowing only, then, like a Buddha, according to Bernie, we would be cut off from compassion, engagement, and helpful action. Helpful action and compassion engagement inevitably involves the world of attachment. Yeah, well, but I'll say something about. So I'm going to come back to this idea about what Buddhahood is as distinct from Bodhisattva later when we do the Indo-Tibetan stuff. But right now, I'm going to focus on the business about attachment and compassion. And it's interesting that, when people ask the Dalai Lama about, well, how can we live in the world without attachment, then he does talk about that compassion involves a kind of attachment these days. And he says this in From Here to Enlightenment. He cites Haribhadra, who talks about that the Bodhisattva's attachment to beings, meaning their compassion and engagement with them. That kind of, loving connection is being, can be used. They use the same word, words actually talking about attachment, but they're not talking about grasping. They're talking about kind of connectedness, or maybe openness to the other person's pain and connectedness, and expressing that as compassion. So Haribhadra is I looked this up. So Haribhadra does use the word attachment, referring to the compassion of Bodhisattva, and he talks about it in the context of a story about a Sangha meeting Maitreya for the first time, and a Sangha sees a dog that's has maggots eating away at it, and he cuts off a piece of flesh from his thigh, and he then uses his tongue to remove the maggots from the dog and put it onto the piece of meat that he just cut off himself, and then Maitreya reveals himself as having been appearing in the form of this dog. So that's the context, for that idea of attachment, and the word attachment being used in relationship to compassion. But anyway, we'll come back to this idea of that, not that there's some kind of way to talk about attachment in relation to Bodhisattva. We'll talk about that too, but also the idea of a Buddha as someone who's gone down the wrong path. Just started out good as a Bodhisattva, then I went a little too far, or something. I don't know exactly. So anyway, what I want to say is that I don't really think, this is just my own opinion now, that all this mystical stuff or the anthropological stuff or the theological stuff about not knowing that we've been trying to explore here, maybe we're interested in those things, but I don't think it's what the doctors and nurses go out to Upaya and Santa Fe for. They're getting something, and it's not, this necessarily. They're getting, professional development credits for one thing, but I assume that they're also, also getting some real skills that are helping them to benefit the people they're working with. So I think it's that she uses this framework to guide people into practicing different kinds of meditation, especially a certain kind of mindfulness meditation. And she basically says that at the beginning of the book, our basic foundation for this practice is going to be breath meditation. And then she explains how to do mindfulness of the breath, and then she extends that out into different kinds of meditations. And she has people, do meditation even, they don't go for refuge at 3 jewels. They just say, we're here to learn how to help people, and this would be a good technique to do it. I made up this phrase, applied darkness, which I think refers to this, because this is how she understands what I'm not saying, that's how she seems to understand what she's doing. She didn't use that word, but it's like an application of darkness, or darkness meaning unknowing. It's like putting not knowing to a practical use, and not just having it, be something that you privately enjoy. And so I wanted to this is meaningful to me, having been through the experience I've been through recently, and I just want to say a little bit about that. So I know from recent experience of being with that to be with a dying person in a hospital setting these days in the United States can be very, very different from being with a dying person in hospice. And my experience is that almost all the nurses, maybe almost every nurse, and many of the doctors as well, seem very kind and like well motivated. They seem like good people, but they're working in institutions that are not based around the interests of the person who's dying. And sometimes you can see them suffering, the nurses, because of the tension between their real care for the person and their institutional obligations. They just like grind against each other. So basically, if you have a dying person in the hospital, the person's very presence in the hospital is a contradiction to the mission of the hospital, which is to heal. And it just immediately sets up all kinds of problems. The very fact of having a person in a hospital who's dying seems to get people uncomfortable, and frankly, I would say that it's at an institutional level. It means that a dying person and a dying person's family are seen as annoyances because they interfere with the basic thing that the hospital's about. Hospital care, at least as I've experienced it in the United States, is driven. We think of it as being driven by the decisions of doctors or doctors in training at teaching hospitals. Doctors in training all working inhuman hours, which make them like zombies. And so they don't, in my experience, usually, there's exceptions, see the actual people that are in their care. By which I mean, they may actually come and see them once in a while, literally, but even then, they don't really see them as persons, right? Each person's a diagnosis, a set of symptoms. They have a very large number of such things, and they have to move on quickly to the next one. And yet these people who are not seeing the sick people or the dying people as people are the people who are the final authorities on the care. Nurses can't really do almost anything without checking with the doctors first, even though the nurses are the ones who are around more. But even if we set aside the doctors, it's like the policies for hospital care are driven by procedures that are established by officials who have a responsibility to address the concerns of the insurance companies and the lawyers for the hospital. And these people don't even come out onto the ward at all. They don't even see, it's not that, they're like the doctors who might see them once in a while. They don't actually see them. It's just like, okay, this is a legal problem. How do we deal with this? And so, let us wish them well. Do you know what I'm saying? Let's not hold it against them, that's their job. Cultivate loving kindness towards them. In other words, I have to, because otherwise I would get grumpy, right? It's an antidote to how I might reflexively feel. But, so in hospice, then this is based on a couple of experiences of mine, and probably you guys have your own. You only have palliative care, and so it's really quite different. Workers usually have watched a lot of people die, and in a sense that gives them a really specialized expertise and a level of comfort with dying that other people don't have. And of course they see patterns, patterns emerge in terms of what kinds of things happen, how people react, and so forth. But then, if they work there long enough, they also see anomalies, like weird things that they hadn't seen before, things that don't quite fit the pattern. And so you can get people who know enough to know just how often they've been wrong by following preconceived grids in the past, in terms of making prognostications about what's going to happen next. When you're saying, oh, this person's in phase 3 and they'll be dead in 36 hours, and then of course they live for 3 months. And then you learn not to say stupid things like that the next time, right? So mindfulness training of the kind that Halifax is offering these people, I think, helps open them up to what's happening to look at it rather than to just immediately pronouncing or judging about it, not imposing their expertise. And this is the fourth stage of such and such. And their judgments also about what's good and bad. That's one of the things that she really emphasizes, instead of saying, oh, there's a good death and here are the rules for it. She never does that. She never does that in her whole book, It's very interesting. She's like, in a sense, the book is about undoing some fixed idea about what death or dying ought to be like. Yeah, I think that's very cool. That's really appealing to me. And so she gives an example of someone else. There's a hospice worker who, on arriving at the house of a dying person, sits in his car in the driveway, always, for a few minutes. And this is what she says: emptying himself of concepts, expertise, expectations, and creating in its place an open attentiveness to whatever he might find inside the house. Okay, so on the one hand, I find this like really good, and on the other hand, there's the Tsongkhapa part of me who says, well, they're going to stop thinking, and then is that really so good? So now you see how I got myself into this. Part of my mind, that darn wanting to know part, is interesting, didn't shut down. And I found myself like watching the hospice workers interact with Valerie while she was dying. Like watching them, observing them, how they acted. And I didn't ever ask them to explain what they were doing. But their first visit was like highly legalistic. Once all these forms were signed and so forth, it was like impossible to not notice how they focused on the person before them, on the patient, on Valerie, and they focused on her in a way that almost nobody else in the healthcare system ever had, even though they had just met her and these other people had known her for a long time. And she was not coherent. So they would also listen very closely what I had to say about, what was happening in the family and what seemed to be happening with her. And also they listened to what I didn't say or how I said things. They were very tuned in to, they were paying attention. I don't know, I was thinking of the word behold, like to hold, to take into your mind, and to first see and to take in fully the person who's before you start acting or giving instructions or making pronouncements that are based on your expertise, right? Yeah, so that's what I saw. So that's, I don't know, if we set aside this applied darkness, this specific operationalizing, which sort of explains why, I got interested in this, and we come back to the idea that how they describe not knowing, what there's different things that Roshi Bernie and Roshi Joan are saying about it. It would seem from, my home base point of view, from a Tsongkhapa point of view, we could say that it is combining, or even we might want to say conflating, if we're being judgmental, several different things that we would really want to distinguish. For example, not having expectations, that's one thing. Being utterly non-conceptual, that's something different. A general calming of discursive thinking is not the same as being utterly non-conceptual. It's something quite distinct. And that seems like, it doesn't seem differentiated. It's hard, you just kind of left floundering to try to figure out exactly what they mean in terms of Tsongkhapa language. And then they also go farther and mix this up with emptiness or the ultimate groundlessness of things. So now you're talking about the fundamental reality of things, or you're talking about the fundamental nature of our mind knowing the fundamental reality of things. So mindfulness, open-mindedness in the sense of being willing to listen, not clinging to a priori conceptualizations. I think also it seems pretty clear a kind of humility and as an antidote to the kind of medical God complex. So this is, all these things are just like, to me these seem like different things, but like they're not different things in the way that Bernie and Joan talk, okay? They're one thing in the way they talk, not knowing. And it's like, oh, that's disturbing to me. But then, so I think this is the way that a lot of things are. we have one set of distinctions, I was saying, that seems super useful to us, like so useful in making sense out of the world that it seems indispensable. I can come here and talk with you because there's such a large overlap in the kinds of distinctions that we're at home with, and maybe we just feel that we may start to feel that these are so useful that these distinctions are themselves part of the structure of reality. and that, then when others conflate these categories, that is, like they putting the eggs, all the eggs in one basket, and then they have another basket for something that we don't even talk about. Everything's mixed up. It appears incoherent to us. You've scrambled. You're not talking sense. So, coming back to where I was starting with this, we can't assume, I don't take it that everyone who teaches spiritual tradition or everyone who understands them as teaching Buddhism is in some sense saying the same thing or pointing at the same mountain using different words. I don't think that's the case. I certainly wouldn't assume that to be so. And sometimes, and His Holiness is pointing to, what he thinks might be cases of that, it could be true. That is, just because people are using different words, it doesn't mean that they aren't talking about the same thing in completely, like, Chinese and English, for example. It's so obvious. But once you develop, languages, and then you have systems of philosophy, which isn't a particular language, but it's analogous in that it chops the world up into certain chunks and then describes how those chunks relate to one another to build a coherent model of the world. But it isn't the world. It's a coherent model of the world that, and so, I don't know. Oh, another example is, maps. Maps are really good examples, right? The map is not the territory. We think of Tsongkhapa's system as a map that works great for us, but it's not the world. It's a map of the world that we find super useful. And other people may find a different kind of map helpful to them. We know that you can take exactly the same landscape and ask a different question and get a completely different map that's you don't recognize as being the same space. And plus also there's another factor about maps and territory, which is that you can't ever make a perfect map. I was looking at some maps yesterday for Venerable Churron, and it's to make this map perfect, it would have to be the world. Yeah. So it's already wrong in some sense as soon as you draw it. But that's not the point. It's how useful is it? How helpful is it to people? And different kinds of maps might be helpful to different people. The Dharma pharmacy, Buddha has lots of different. Only a quack just tells everybody that they need exactly the same medicine, whether they have arthritis or cancer or acne. That's a quack, right? That's not Dr. Buddha's way. Yeah. Okay, so that brings me to the end of what I wanted to say about parts 1 and 2. And I would be now at the beginning of part 3, which is about the Zen, Chan Zen roots of not knowing. And just to preview this, what I'm going to do is try to say the specific, even though, I can't trace back this 3 tenets farther than Bernie. I can't say, here's what Bodhidharma said about the 3 tenets per se. But the idea of not knowing as the first tenet has a very, very, very old, deep history in East Asia. And it's formulated in different ways. But there's lots of things that connect with this, very obviously and explicitly, in the Chan Zen tradition and its antecedents. And so that's what I want to try to explore next. And then, as I said, we'll briefly talk about Christianity. There's surprising things in Christianity, for example, that relate to this more than you would expect. And then we'll just look at that briefly. And then we have to go into, now in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, which, or Indian tradition, Indian Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, you don't exactly have something that linguistically maps to not knowing directly as, that language pattern is being used. But the underlying idea of coming to get rid of stuff, to get rid of things as the path, and to attain to a state of not knowing, absolutely is there in both India and Tibet, not in Gelugpa. And so, even though the words not knowing are not there, the ideas aren't just concocted in East Asia. They have a Buddhist lineage, and so, and that lineage kind of flows down and ends up in a place of being, Tsongkhapa's opponents when he's writing Lama and Chemo, right? And so, that's what I wanted to go on to do next. Now, so we have 20 minutes left. Should I start on this? I'll just start on Zen, right? Or, okay. Yeah, why don't, that would be better. I mean, because I feel like maybe this is if you want to have questions now, this would be a good time, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to try and see how I can formulate the meditation bar of this concept myself. And there's two things that came up, and I sometimes do the woo-woo thing of going on my bookshelf and seeing what comes down and words of my perfect teacher. And in that, I was thinking about this not knowing, and it was the word familiarity. Mm-hmm. And I realized for me, it's not that I don't know, it's that I'm not familiar. Because then it gives me that suggestion, information that I will know, that it's not familiar. Mm-hmm. Because I don't have the habit of that way of noticing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not yet familiar. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is I was reading Bell Hooker's book, God Gave Me the Hope. And she has a whole chapter in that of not knowing. And she addresses something that I've been looking at in general with who I am in a step in this world, looking at duality and all that, and so on, and so on, and Buddhist concepts. But as I'm working more with cultural competency and who I am in the world, as a Western European woman, and how it's important for me to label things and know things. Mm-hmm. And then interacting with people who are not people of color or people of community, that labeling and naming is not personality. And then realizing, that's another way of finding not familiar. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see how I intersect in the world from my own perspective, the different perspective I know. Right. And that there are other ways of being, and so, and that it's not for myself, I know this is the question, but I like that what you said, knowing that I don't know, or knowing that I'm not familiar, that it's conventional, and that the ultimate is to become familiar. Discern between what. Am I making
I don't have the whole picture of what you're conveying, but there's a lot of things that I can connect to. Like this idea of familiarity, in one sense, it means, meditation, practice, accustoming ourselves to something intimately so that it becomes not just like an idea, but it becomes, part of who we are, like a habit or a character to see things in a different way. Like it's not enough to understand something, right? We have to become familiar with it through practicing it in order to incorporate it into how we relate to the world. I mean, a superficial example of this would be like the fact that you have various people were declared in Zen traditions, to have achieved Satori, who then committed war crimes, And it's like, well, how does one explain this? You have to say, well, people can have amazing experiences and yet it not go to the point of fully soaking into and transforming their character as they lead their day-to-day lives. And so in that case, it's not even just intellectual. Somebody's like had a transformative experience, but it hasn't sunk all the way down to their bones. It's like a moment of, you can have an amazing experience one time and just store it up like a spiritual treasure. The other thing is that I don't know, if you're, this word, there's this super important word that they use all the time in Zen is intimacy. They're constantly talking about intimacy. And to me, that I can't help but thinking about that when you're focusing on the word familiarity, because it's an extension of this. It's like there's one of the koans we'll do this afternoon is like not knowing. The punchline is not knowing is most intimate. So, like having an idea about, like to try to explain this without criticizing, right? Having an idea about something is always to hold it at arm's length. The intimacy with it is something other than that, right? Where you become familiar with it, so it becomes part of who you are, right? And you're intimately, you don't see yourself as being separate from it. So in conceptual thought, we have a sense of ourselves and the object that we know. And I don't know, I think, I'm going to try, I think this is a lot of where this problem comes from, is that there's one Zen teacher, and now unfortunately I don't remember who it was, who said that the basic problem is that I think I'm in here and you're out there. And so that's an important problem for sure, and how you understand or comment on that is important. What you think he means, but if we see the other as something that's distant and cut off from ourselves, right? Then we can't get to that sense of familiarity or intimacy, and conceptual thought has that nature of having us hold something in mind means we're holding it in a sense. I don't want to say at arm's length, but at mind's length. Yeah, you're holding it as an object in your mind, which means it's separate from you, right? And so if you say that the basic problem, and you don't add anything to it, is that we have this dualistic sense of separate from one another, and it's very much tied up with conceptual thought, because conceptual thought operates in that way. So what we need to do is just stop thinking about stuff, right? Because when we think about stuff, we obviously are separating ourselves from it, and that seems to be inaccurate, because you lose the intimacy. So let's stop thinking about stuff, and then we'll just be nakedly paying attention to it and gain a kind of intimacy with the world. That seems to be what they're pointing at, I'm trying to just explain it, but without criticizing it, because that would not be the own position of Tsongkhapa, right? Yeah.
So a question that I've been thinking about a lot lately and contemplating is about creativity in different religions. And when I'm hearing what you're saying, I think about the program I just watched about God, and sort of reputation of the existence of God.
Yeah.
Maybe not exactly, but there's kind of sort of the whole sort of square, and there's not there. But the idea is that all matters. There's energy, all energy is matter. There's this sort of inverse relationship, but experientially, when I am thinking about that, like, the Big Bang, how does this, how all of this is, I think about experientially several different species in my life, or moments in my life, or experiences in my life, but one in particular where I was in the water and I was snorkeling, and I had this sort of luminous experience of being completely one with everything. And for me, what you're talking about is just that space, or that awareness, or, and that there is no differentiation. And at the same time, having been raised with this idea of God creator, I don't find any necessary conflict. It's kind of like, oh, well, this idea is this, but it is definitely one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, what exactly is the creation myth in Buddhism? And is it myth?
Would say that the best answer is to say that Buddhism doesn't have a creation myth. But, I mean, there are creation stories in Buddhism, which I would call myths as a scholar religion, where we use myth to mean like a sacred story that gives people a sense of meaning in the world and a sense of where things came from. But it has to do with like the origins of a particular world, this particular world, and it's like always premised on the idea that that's not the absolute beginning, that there is, and this is the way I understand it, is that when Buddha was asked about like the ultimate beginning of things, he seemed to be making it pretty clear that that wasn't like a helpful kind of way to approach things. That we should focus on like, well, what's our situation right now? What are the causes that are giving rise to that situation? And how can we, undo the causes of needless misery, right? Rather than like, how did it all get started in the first place? Like, so it goes into the realm of speculation rather than in terms of what's actually helpful in the hospice. And then, in addition to that, nonetheless, I mean, it's pervasive in the Buddhist world to think of the universe as, or think of universes as beginningless. Not this universe, but universes, why? And, well, because that everything that arises and acts as a cause for the next moment down to the present has to have had some causes and conditions that were there before. And then, so His Holiness approaches these, creation stories with the kind of analytical mind. He thinks, okay, let's suppose there was like this God in the beginning that didn't have anything. It was just self-instituting divine being, and everything just comes from that. Like, okay, so if this self-instituting divine being, is of the nature to, and is eternal and permanent, because it didn't arise in time, and then we could say that, either she is continuously creating worlds all the time, or that she never is. How do we decide that sometimes she does and sometimes she doesn't pop out a universe? And because if there's some conditions under which she creates a universe and some that she doesn't, then she's obviously changeable. It's like, oh, I'm in a mood to make a world this month. What is a month? Well, I'll make that too. I mean, but then, it's like then there's change, and it's not really an eternal thing. So it means it's that being who's creating the world is now dependent on causes and conditions. Something is affecting her or it, to make a world or not. And then you just keep going. It was like, well, you can't really point to like a first cause. One of the most popular arguments for the existence of God in the West, and not only in Christianity, is this idea that it's impossible to think about beginninglessness because, so everything that we see has a cause, but since we can't conceive of there being a beginningless chain of causation, there must have been an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, a maker. Yeah. Yeah. How much does it matter, do you saying?
Well, no, I'm guessing even that essentially there's that piece of interconnectedness that the self.
Oh, I see.
That's kind of where I'm
Yeah.
thinking about. But then you brought up causality, and I think about karma in Buddhism, and that sort of mythology. That's kind of like a good idea.
Well, I'm going to start with the first part of what you said. I think I think what you're saying is, referring back to your snorkeling experience and this idea that you can have an idea of a divine creator and yet experience a kind of dissolution of the kind of constructed self in a sense of boundaryless oneness, with everything. Yeah, that's like, very true. This is, I don't know, this is, how is that guy's name? Romain Rolland, when Freud wrote The Future of an Illusion, and, about religion is, just an illusion that gives people some compensatory. And Romain Rolland, who was his friend and a poet, wrote to him and said, well, you're missing something, and that religion is really, in its best sense, based on this experience that many people have had, like the one that you're described, and that you haven't taken that into account in your account of religion. And so Freud begins his next book, Civilization is Discontents, by talking about this correspondence directly. And he said, he has never had this. He doesn't know what it means. So he has to then, but he takes it seriously. He believes that his friend has had this, and so then he has to try to take that into account, and think, well, what could this possibly be that people are having this? And he comes up with the idea that it's a recovered memory of when we were very, very little babies being held by our mothers, and we had no sense of, separation. And he used the phrase, oceanic feeling. I always had the idea that he was saying it was like a memory from the womb, but actually when you reread it, he doesn't quite say that. He's talking about oceanic feeling while you're actually in the ocean, right? Of dissolving of artificial boundaries in your sense of identity that could, come about. So it seems clear that there's a lot of people who've had experiences like this, and they have different ideas about what to make of it and what that means. Like I was saying, you have this experience. How do we understand it? If you have a Buddhist culture, then you have one set of interpretive categories that help you talk about, what you're experiencing. And if you have a Christian culture or a Taoist culture, then you have a different set of categories to think about what that means. I don't know what you want me, whether you want me to tell you, what a Buddhist view would be, but it's true that people, maybe one way to put it would be to say, look, we hold on to an artificially constructed sense of self, and that it's false, and that it could be that people get some sort of intuition of that, even without systematically analyzing and deconstructing it. Maybe, you know what I'm saying? Maybe that's possible, right? The question is whether that's really the spiritual path to be pursued. And some kinds of Buddhism think that it is, and others think, well, no, because when you just set your mind in this kind of open spaciousness, that you haven't really identified, you haven't really understood what it is that you're meditating on. That there has to be kind of some content. Well, that's a question. Is there some content to this understanding? Or is it just like a content-free vacation from the burden of feeling myself here apart from the world? That's a good way to put it, because this is Buddha had this, when he, according to the life story of the Buddha, right, he learned to meditate amazingly well before he became awakened, right, and so he had these kinds of experiences, and then afterwards he would say, well, that was great, but I don't actually understand anything deeper or more useful about how to live. How do I make the connection between this dissolution of ordinary consciousness and now how I should approach life in the world? And so that's kind of where the way that Buddhists look at other traditions is to say, well, everybody can have these experiences, and they even have techniques for generating amazing experiences. Right. What do you do with it, and what do you understand it as being about? What kind of experience when you construct a set of Buddhism is always about constructing methods for training. It's not just about like, here's some stuff to believe. It's always about training the mind in something or other. So the question is, when we set up a system for training the mind, what are we trying to train the mind to attain? And is it a content-free state? Is it a state where we realize our oneness with the divine creator? You know what I'm saying? Is it a state where we, are relieved of the burden of having any thoughts at all? Or is it a state where we actually have a kind of non-dualistic understanding of some specific thing that's, Buddhist emptiness? That would be what Buddhist would say.